GLP-1, it's a peptide which is secreted in the intestine when we eat a meal. And it then stimulates insulin secretion from the pancreas and lowers glucose levels in the blood. The regulatory mechanism, which involves GLP-1, it's part of a larger network of metabolic hormones, which include glucagon and insulin. And together, these metabolic networks maintain glucose levels at steady levels at all the time. And so in the 1970s, when I started to work in the field of peptides, one of the outstanding questions was how peptides regulate glucose metabolism. And a very intense area of research was to discover the so-called incretins, because that's what incretins do. They regulate glucose metabolism when we take a meal. My discovery was to identify the biologically active sequence of GLP-1 and to show that is an incretin which has therapeutic potential for treatment of diabetes. So I will briefly describe my experiments which led to that discovery. So in order to prove that GLP-1 is an incretin, I developed a strategy in which I developed a specific strategy which included several steps. The first step was to synthesize by the solid phase method large amounts of GLP-1, and then to use from the single synthesis the synthetic GLP-1 in all the experiments. And that included developing very accurate analytical methods which will allow me to detect it in the intestine. That's where you find incretins. And then to use it in the perfused pancreas rat animal model to show that it stimulates insulin release at very low concentrations, and that stimulation is glucose dependent. And those two sets of experiments, finding GLP-1 in the intestine and proving that it's a potent insulin secretagogue, proved that GLP-1 is the incretin. In follow-up experiments at the Massachusetts General Hospital, we used the synthetic GLP-1 in individuals with diabetes. And we showed that it stimulates insulin release and, very importantly, lowers blood glucose. And that was the first clinical experiment, a first study, which showed that GLP-1 can be used as a new medicine to treat diabetes. The first milestone was in 2005. That's when the first GLP-1 analog was introduced to the market under the name of Byetta. But it was a lizard. It was a peptide which was discovered from the saliva of the lizard by John Eng. And that was remarkable. And it was the Amylin biotech company who developed it then for pharmacological use under the name of Byetta. So it was a substance which you inject twice a day, and for 5 years was the only available GLP-1 analog for treatment of diabetes. That particular, having Byetta as a pharmaceutical preparation, I think broke what I think it's a glass ceiling, because it showed for the first time that you can use peptides as medicines. This view was not very much favored by the pharmaceutical industry in the 1900s and 1990s, and 2000. So that was the first one. And as I mentioned, for 5 years, the only available one. But GLP-1 7 to 37 cannot be used as a drug by itself. It's very quickly destroyed by an enzyme, DPP4, or dipeptyl peptidase 4. And it has a half-life in circulation for only 3 minutes. And in order to overcome that, several pharmaceutical companies developed inhibitors of that enzyme. And this was really the first GLP-1 based medicine, because it was the endogenous GLP-1, the one which was made in the body. So what this inhibitor did was it just prolonged this half-life, so it lasted for several hours. And that's why it's taken once a day. And the main advantage was that it suppresses hypoglycemia, low blood sugar, which is one of the really side effects of taking insulin. And also some of the other available diabetic drugs like sulfonylureas. And so that was in 2006, and there were many variations. Merck was the first, but there were several other pharmaceutical companies. And so I think that was the second milestone, and especially that was the first GLP-1 based medicine. And then 2010, it was really, I think, a jump when Novo Nordisk, pharmaceutical company, developed liraglutide. What they did was to extend the half-life of GLP-1 in circulation was to conjugate a long chain of lipids to the active sequence of GLP-1. And the rationale there was that lipids are very hydrophobic, and they will bind to the protein albumin, which circulates, and the albumin will protect the degradation of GLP-1. And so it was very effective, but was injectable, and it was for once a daily. It's here, as opposed to Januvia, this was done in pharmacological concentrations, which are about 10 to 100 times higher than the GLP-1 which circulates in our bodies. And after several years of the market, and after thousands of people took Victoza, thousands of diabetics took Victoza, it was noticed that there is weight loss, about 8 to 10%. And in 2015 was then the first milestone when it comes to obesity. It was approved to be used for weight loss under the trade name of Saxenda. Now, the other big milestone is 2017, when a long-lasting GLP-1 analog, semaglutide, was introduced by Novo Nordisk. The scientists there conjugated a different chain of lipids to the active sequence of GLP-1. And they also made some minor changes in the sequence of GLP-1, which protected them from the degradation by the enzyme DPP4. And remarkably, they extended the half-life to 1 week. And so that was very convenient. And again, as 1,000 people start taking semaglutide or Ozempic, they noticed that they lost a lot of weight. This was unprecedented at the time, 15%. And that's when it became very widely used, not only for weight loss for obese patients, but also for cosmetic weight loss. And now, in 2022, 2 years ago, I think there is another milestone when even a more effective medicine was developed for weight loss. it's based on the concept which was developed by Richard DiMarchi and Matthias Chopp of so-called polyagonism. And the first example of that is tirzepatide. It's a tongue twister, which is sold under the name of Zepbound by Lilly. And of course, it's very effective also for treatment of diabetes under the trade name of Mounjaro. What they did is something really very novel, in which they came up with a peptide which does not exist in the nature. They combined the sequences of GLP-1 with those of another incretin, gastric inhibitory polypeptide, or a GIP. And they found that the patients remarkably use over 20% of weight. And this is now the gold standard. Can we do better than that? They can do better than semaglutide, but I think that's where the challenge is. And there are a lot of companies, including Novo Nordisk and Eli Lilly, who are now combining GLP-1 or semaglutide with different pancreatic and intestinal peptides to see whether the combination can lead even to higher weight loss. So what's important, what happened in this, what have been shown in the past 15 years with the introduction of these new medicines, is that discovery that GLP-1 is an incretin opened the new frontiers in which we can use peptides to treat obesity. And I think it's very optimistic for the future. So we know now, again, from different individuals taking Ozempic, that it actually can influence drug addiction. We know that it has very positive cardiovascular effects, and it has been approved for treating cardiovascular disorders and have effects on the kidney. That has been also approved. There are also reports that it can have influence on especially Parkinson's disease. But when it comes to treating addiction and the Parkinson's disease, I think this is still studies which are done on a very small number of people, 100. And we don't also understand how that happens. It's clearly the effect of GLP-1 in the brain. So all of these things are telling us that maybe there can be effects, but in my own view, we have to really wait until we understand the biology now. So what we are seeing now, it's a really, again, new paradigm in which we see the clinical experience guiding the future research to understand some very basic concepts, how GLP-1 acts in the brain. And I'm sure that will open, again, new areas in which we'll try to understand how other peptides, which exist like amylin, acts also in the brain to regulate appetite and all these other conditions. So I think we have to wait for those results. And I know that's the major focus of a lot of neuroscientists. So I have a very strong opinion that they should be used only by patients with obesity. I think obesity is a serious chronic condition, and I think if anything what Ozempic and these GLP-1 drugs did is to show that it's a real disease. It's not something which is cosmetic. But I think for the most of the people who are not overweight, I don't think it's appropriate to use it. I think there are many other ways in which we can do that, by changing our lifestyles, by watching our diets, by exercising. So I think they should be used only by obesity. And we know there is such a prevalent it's almost epidemic, and they will need all of that. The shortage of this GLP-1, it's partially because people were not using, because they was using for cosmetic reasons, and I think and the obese patients were the ones which suffered from that. And another thing which is very important, that they have to be at a price which is affordable to the majority of the population. And that's what we need to really work on, because it's too expensive, especially in the United States. And many insurance companies don't cover it. So I think our effort should be focused on finding ways in which the prices are affordable